Welcome to an Understanding episode 21. This episode will be about Chester A. Arthur. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Enjoy. There's a grocery store. I believe it's a Mediterranean grocery store. Kalustingen, whatever you want to call it specifically. I think is the actual name of the grocery store. The first two floors of the actual building itself. It's a brownstone. It's at 123 Lexington Avenue. It still exists to this day, where about 120 years ago, a man named Chester A. Arthur once lived, where he stood and where he actually sat in a chair, awaiting, sometimes in tears, depending on various different sources of information and specifically news of a fellow former president and the man that he was the vice president at the time for, James A. Garfield, whether he was going to survive or not. He waited there. He spent all summer there. He actually hid there, very fearful, because he knew there's a very real possibility he could become president. And not only a very real possibility, it was almost certain that he was going to become president. You see, as I noted before, James A. Garfield had been assassinated, or at the very least had been shot, effectively over the summer. And for 3 months, Chester A. Arthur waited in anticipation for the potential that James A. Garfield might, expire. It's actually really interesting, because when I think about it, Chester A. Arthur wasn't really Garfield's first choice. He was much more of an appointed individual to assert the ideals of, stalwart Republican values for the most part. And I think in part as well for Ross Conkling to have one of his guys in there, someone that he could trust other than just a cabinet position. Especially when you hold the patronage specifically, or the role of the customs house at the Port of New York, which is a big lucrative position. You hold a lot of power and a lot of weight, and, conspiracy theories might arise where, Conkling might have had Garfield assassinated. Who knows? Politics is interesting. It's, conspiracy theories are only conspiracy theories until they're proven true. Obviously there's some crazy ones, but, it's not implausible, to be quite honest with you. And who knows, maybe the guy that Conkling brought up, Chester A. Arthur, could actually hold the position of the president. For Arthur, it's a mixed bag. There's different interpretations of how he was feeling, of his thought process for the most part. Part of it had to do with, who wants to become president. It's a lot of power. It's also a lot of responsibility, and Arthur, by all accounts, is someone that's probably one of the more emotional presidents. That's one that's much more feeling. And when I mean he was crying and all that stuff, he had genuine tears for James A. Garfield when he did expire and pass away, unfortunately. He was enthusiastic. He was very, very excited in the sense of this is a big new step. Things are moving, machinations are happening, and the moment that he finds out that James A. Garfield dies, Chester A. Arthur receives a knock on his door at 123 Lexington Avenue. It's basically his cabinet, or at least Garfield's cabinet, and a bunch of people from Congress for the most part. James A. Garfield's still in tears. He's still scared. Hours prior, he's shooing away press, basically. He shutters into his home. At 2:15 a.m., Chester A. Arthur, is sworn in as the 21st president of the United States of America from his parlor in his home today. That house is still there. It's in that place, that Mediterranean grocery store, and that named Kalustingen, I believe it's called, which inhabits the first two floors of this building. History was made there. We don't think about it. And I always want to just point out, I think it's interesting. History is made in these buildings, and moments that we think about sometimes. I think it's incredible. It's beautiful, and we should never take it for granted. And ultimately, in this particular building at 123 Lexington Avenue, the 21st President of the United States was officially sworn in. Chester A. Arthur was our president back then. Chester A. Arthur is this country's 21st president and the 20th vice president, which I think is just something you should note. Sorry for that slow opening. Chester A. Arthur is a pretty interesting individual. He's one that I've done a decent amount of research on, and one that, I tend to really have very interesting feelings on. Not really positive or negative, because, and I'll probably get more into this when I talk about his actual presidency. Chester A. Arthur comes at a point in this country's history that should just be noted for its very complicated era in particular. He's right in the thick of what effectively would be the progressive movement, just that particular era, which just should be noted as a very complicated and corrupt time within our country's history. Big business, government themselves. Henry Adams, one author, notes specifically that disillusioned sage of the era described the political life of the country after the Civil War as, less than glowing terms. The government does not govern, Congress is ineffective and inefficient, and shows itself to be more and more incompetent the more power it wields and the more that they force it upon the people. I just want to point that out, that, for Chester A. Arthur, he comes in at a very unique point within this country's history. He's really right in the middle of it, and it's really unfortunate that he's really not one of the more well-known individuals and presence in this country's history. People know about Andrew Johnson, but they know more about Andrew Johnson primarily due to the fact of his impeachment trial, in fairness, but James A. Garfield wasn't Lincoln by any stretch of the imagination, but still something that, the second president ever to, or, well, technically speaking, the third president to ascend to the presidency, or fourth president. God, there's been too many. Our country's been chaotic, to be quite honest with you. It's just been pure chaos. But the second one to be specifically due to the president being assassinated, to ascend to the presidency. Overall, he does a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. I think a lot of things that Arthur represents tend to be really good, and he's a very interesting individual, very complicated individual. Little things that I tend to really look at in terms of their character really define Arthur in a lot of ways. He's the kind of guy that has a lot of nuances and does a lot of little things that you're kind of just like, oh, okay, I think I kind of get you. He's the kind of person that'll. And then this is, I believe, recorded within just little facts and tidbits about Chester A. Arthur, that, he would sometimes take, hours to dress because he wanted to impress people with his looks specifically. The guy has probably the single most famous facial hair that this country has ever really seen, which I think is always really interesting because, you don't think of our presidents anymore, probably since Teddy, or at least William Howard Taft, as men with, great facial hair. But no one's going to beat Chester A. Arthur. Let's just be 100% honest with you. It's really beautiful and brilliant. Anyways, I'm getting way off track and way off topic. When Chester A. Arthur comes into office, it's a really interesting point because, everyone thinks the government and country is ineffective, to be quite honest with you, at the very least, in terms of stopping corruption, allowing corruption to happen, little things like that. And Chester A. Arthur kind of comes in as someone who's not really wanted, someone who's really not needed, and someone who's viewed in a lot of ways as coming from corruption. You want to talk about a lot of things that are happening in today's political machinations, but back then, can you just imagine, basically having the equivalent of, say, I don't know, Hillary Clinton's drone, whatever you want to call it, just rising up through the ranks to become the vice president and then becoming the president. It's kind of like that, if I'm going to be quite honest. But I think it's very fascinating and really interesting. And in fairness to Chester A. Arthur, I think you would have to deem his presidency a relative success just on the basic fact that he really held this country together, did a lot of really good things, did a lot of really bad things, but for the most part was not an abhorrent failure, if that makes any sense in the stretch of the imagination. Historically, he will always be considered an unknown president and an unknown individual, and someone who isn't looked on too fondly, positively or negatively. He's just forgotten, unfortunately, in the halls of history. And it's people like Chester A. Arthur that I wanted to do episodes on and really focus and shed a light on in just terms of the things that he's done. Every single point within this country's history should always be noted, but, for men like Chester A. Arthur, they're not. And it's unfortunate. This is a very complicated point in history with a whole bunch of different unique interpretations of information, I guess you could say. There's too many books, there's too many different things, and to really look into when it comes to not only the presidents, but just the time period itself, where, this is probably the first era, I guess you could say, the post-Civil War era, where, I don't know, at least historically speaking, whether things are 100% true or potentially we're just being fed a narrative. And, it's unfortunate because, when we start looking at these guys and start looking at these political figures, kind of guys like Chester A. Arthur, Rutherford B. Hayes, James A. Garfield, the presidents of this particular era, it's unfortunate. Some are good and some are really bad. I left thinking Hayes was good, and then after a week I felt he really wasn't technically elected or a reasonably elected individual and didn't really do anything. And Arthur probably, or James A. Garfield probably would have been, similar to that, and then Arthur just seems like at the very least a very different version of that, but one that's better and actually try to do something different and try to be better, which, I always have to give props to. I guess ultimately what I'm trying to say is Arthur's complicated, and he's only more complicated due to the reality of the era that he became president, how he became president, and every single factor that you can think of in this multivariate analysis of how one judges a presidency or how one looks at a presidency or how one should look at a presidency. Arthur comes in probably within the top 5 or 10 in terms of just, it's very complicated to fairly determine whether this was good or not. That being said, that's what this episode's for. We're going to go into his life, his childhood, his upbringing, his life. What did he do with his life? So without further ado, let's get started with Chester A. Arthur. I do apologize. Chester A. Arthur's childhood. Chester Alan Arthur was born on October 5th, 1829 in Fairfield, Vermont, the United States of America, which is contested in certain books and certain articles that his birthplace is a little bit contested. It was contested, I think, also when he ascended to the presidency, politics for little reasons. It's generally accepted, though, Fairfield, Vermont. Also a little bit complicated, too, is that some books state that he was born in a log cabin, even though specifically James A. Garfield would be the last president born in a log cabin. Depends. I've actually seen pictures of the house. It looks like an actual small shed, effectively. I wouldn't say they're specifically logs, it's more of just lumber for the most part, and planks that is built out of. But, depends on how you want to look at it. You could say him, or you could say James A. Garfield, but he's born there, in a house akin to that. Anyways, his mother was Malvina Stone. She was born in Vermont as well. Her specific parents were George Washington Stone and Judith Stevens. A lot of people naming their kids, after George Washington. Her family was English and Welsh, I believe. Her grandfather had fought within the Continental Army. Chester Alan Arthur. Chester Arthur's father was William Arthur. He was actually born in Ireland, Irishman. He was a bit of a cocky or crazily individual. He was part of the Presbyterian family, specifically of Scottish-Irish descent. So Chester A. Arthur is English, Welsh, and Scottish-Irish specifically. His father was, I believe, a minister, and he was a bit of a kooky minister at that. Local lore, the Reverend himself, or not minister, he was a Reverend, sorry. Reverend specifically was a lively Irishman, as one book points out. He danced around when he found out that Chester had basically been born. So in the early goings of their life, they initially were in Fairfield, but where they wouldn't actually be there for long. They would actually be moving a couple of times and would soon leave Fairfield. Arthur would always move from place to place, for the most part, along with his family. Go everywhere. His father was a Reverend Arthur. We go from place to place, trying to find, any place that he can teach, any place that he can reverend and minister in certain churches, etc., etc. he was a Baptist minister, I believe. He would just go from place to place, and for the first decade of Chester A. Arthur's life, it was a little bit chaotic. Trying to find a place to settle for the most part. Around the time that he was born in, too, it didn't help at the very least in terms of the financial up and down in some way, shape, and form. Because, by the time he's like 7 or 8, the Panic of 1837 is going to occur right after Andrew Jackson leaves the presidency, which, again, is kind of cool because, it's like, oh, Chester Arthur was around when Andrew Jackson was president. It's pretty cool. Anyways, his family would just keep moving from place to place. He would actually finally settle in the state of New York, specifically in Union Village, New York, when Chester was 10 years old. He was actually really close to Schenectady. Schenectady, I believe, is what the town is called, or the city is called. At least modern day what is modern day Schenectady. His nickname was Chet, by the way, for young Chester. Sorry, I just think it's funny, Chet. It's kind of like for Teddy Roosevelt, they would always call him TD. I just think it's funny, Chet. Anyways, Chester Arthur was the 5th child out of 8. He had 6 sisters and 1 older brother, specifically. He had a lot of kids, and his father, William, had a lot of kids, and, in order to support them, he would basically go from place to place to, teach go to different places and have different teaching positions at various different schools, whether it was in Jericho or Waterville or various different states. I think he also studied law at one point too to help try and support the family. But being a minister was always going to be big at number one for William Arthur. Ultimately, if you had to choose between your religion or law, he was going to choose religion. And it's kind of funny, too. Chester Arthur is really a lot like his father, for the most part. He was an abolitionist. He really inherited a lot of his father's abolitionist, I guess you could say, political ideas and leanings, I guess you could say. It really made him unpopular with a lot of the members of his congregation. Specifically his Baptist congregation. It's just really interesting, which is also a big reason why they moved from place to place, because, even in the 1830s, New York, while it was slowly becoming abolitionist, abolitionists were not popular people. They just weren't. I mean, people didn't like slavery, but, a lot of people had the connotation that being an abolitionist was really not good. It was kind of violent, was not the best of situations, places, whatever you want to call it, It was kind of like being a radical individual, and, John Brown and all that stuff. That gives the idea of the negative opinion of abolitionists is probably one way to look at it. But anyways, they would finally settle in Union, in New York, specifically. Really good for Chester Arthur to finally be able to settle down in Union Village. Family life was really interesting for Arthur. He grew up as a pretty emotional kid. I mean, he had 6 sisters for the most part. In a little tidbit, too, I think 6 or 7 of his siblings would actually live to be in adulthood. He would... I think he'd have one more brother, but a younger brother, but he would only live to be like 1 or 2, unfortunately. But for him, his entire family was very close-knit. Most of his siblings, which I think is a unique rarity, would actually live to be adults, really, for the most part. I mean, most of them outlived Chester A. Arthur, to be quite honest with you, which I think is really fascinating and interesting. Chester Arthur died really young, and I'll get to that later. I think he was maybe 57 or so. I don't even think he was 60 yet. But ultimately, they were a really tightly close-knit family. His father was very determined to help him teach and learn. He learned the fundamentals of reading and writing, really, with his family and his parents. Arthur would basically learn from place to place. He would go from school to school. He would learn everywhere, really. He was really, I don't even want to say a gifted student. I think most books and people would probably say he was average, but he was a pretty bright kid. I think he was a bit of an emotional young lad is probably the best way I could probably put it. He's also very early on a pretty political young lad. I mean, when he was like 12 years old, he's like, I'm basically a Whig, and was very much against James K. Polk. There was actually one book where they got into a fight, family and whatnot, because of his father's political upbringing. And he was greatly influenced by his father in basically every single step and regard. He actually got into a fight with some kids in a schoolyard about, I think it was specifically the presidency of James K. Polk. Which little interesting things. I don't want to say was 14, 15 years old. Anyways, he was also very pro-Irish, which, around that particular time, for the next 100 years, it seems like, people just didn't like the Irish because they just kept coming over and taking jobs, etc., etc. You know how it goes. Immigration, am I right? But the politics, and he was always very much a part of that idea and belief, ultimately, that, we're all people, for the most part, and I guess it's interesting, he had a really, at least very early on, it seems like, when he sticks to an idea, sticks to a belief, he's much more inclined to look at things from a much more emotional perspective than a rational, objective perspective, which is interesting. Excuse me, because a lot of the presidents before that really didn't follow that creed, really, for the most part. Some did, but for Arthur, a lot of things were really based off of emotion, at least in some aspects in his early childhood. Arthur also had a bit of an interesting economic situation when it came to finances with his family. In New York especially, but a lot of the states had ups and downs, ebbs and flows. I mean, you have to understand, people were very political back then because it directly affected their lives and their livelihoods. So people were probably more inclined to believe one way or another, specifically if it helped benefit them. And it's interesting to really conceptualize it in that way. And I think it's going to be and I think it's more interesting, especially back then, with the ups and downs and the ebbs and flows of, the economic problems that occurred, especially in the early goings of his childhood. There were a lot of ups and downs, but for the most part, his family really staved them off financially. Being a school teacher and basically a minister, he was able to really shield his family economically, especially with a lot of kids too, which is kind of funny and insane to think about. And he had a lot of sway and a lot of power within Union Village specifically. And it's also, the family was also very close and would visit Albany from time to time too, which is the state capital of New York. And it's pretty interesting. Just the ebbs and flows of economics back then. He lived through the Panic of 1837, but didn't really feel the effects as much, and lived through a whole bunch of ups and downs of the economic turmoil that would occur for the next 5-6 years after that, and up until, he started becoming a young adult, a young man, and really started growing into and becoming who he was, effectively, which is a very Irish-loving and specifically pretty well-educated, smart, well-spoken young man who was really capable of doing a lot of things, really. He had a bright future, when he was about 15, 16 years old. And just like a lot of the other kids, a lot of the young people who wanted to really progress in society and really move up the food chain, it was through schooling, academics, etc., etc. So he decides he's going to roll into school. He also wanted to stay close. So he decided he was going to roll in Union College in Schenectady when he was about 15 years old in 1844, 1845. There, he studied a lot. He did his undergraduate studies there specifically. He studied everything, the general classical curriculum, the Greeks, the Roman classics, and their original for the most part. Especially at a time, and which is good for him because that was at a time when their literature specifically was going for more modern interpretations of stuff. But he really learned a whole bunch of different things, and he loved the classics, Homer, Cicero, little things like that. But aside from the classics, he really didn't care all that much about, really school and education, really, for the most part. He was really into just the politics of things. He ended up joining the society called the Fenian Brotherhood. Apparently it's a Irish organization, and he would wear green coats to support effectively the organization. Little things like that I always find really interesting. But he really got into politics even more, basically from that point on. Main reason, ultimately, for the most part, was just his belief in the one and serious issue of the time specifically that he was always dedicated to was slavery. He was basically just purely in opposition, 100% against slavery, 100% an abolitionist. He rallied and railed against human bondage, basically as much as and often as he probably could. He would basically, and I'm gonna just skip ahead a little bit. He'd actually be, as a lawyer, defending a whole bunch of different slaves for the most part and trying to fight for their freedoms. But for Chester A. Arthur, it was basically that. He was just gonna focus on that for the most part. Not to mention, too, he's a young lad. He's 15, 16 years old. He ended up doing a whole bunch of different hijinks, drinking, doing school pranks and stuff like that. Joined a frat, the Phi Beta Kappa frat. I think it's the Phi Beta Kappa frat. Yes, the Phi Beta Kappa frat, or the fraternity specifically. He would graduate in 1848. Despite not being a great or outstanding student, he would still graduate, relatively speaking, in the top 5 of his class. After college, he was in a bit of a funk. He didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. He thought long and hard about his future. He taught school on the side for the most part. He basically did it full time because he would teach during winter breaks and recesses in order to make a living while he was basically going to school and getting education. And we would also do some debating and stuff on the side just for fun, which is little tidbits I like to read. He was the president of the debating club at his fraternity. He really didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. What he did want to do was have fun. What he wanted to do was really enjoy life. And also, in some way, shape, and form, really do something that was going to give him some, I don't want to say status, but he wanted to be, specifically, live the life of a true gentleman, is probably what one of the books says. Whether that was, being a public servant or, someone of status for the most part, whether that meant you actually had to go into public servitude, or not servitude, but, be a public worker or be a lawyer. And those were the main things that people could do back then in order, no one wants to be a farmer, And ultimately, he just decided, I'm going to focus on that. So while going to learn school and stuff, he would actually end up beginning his law education. He'd start reading some books and begin really reading as much as he possibly could. Every single law book that he could get his hands on. Arthur got a bunch of different opportunities. He would take as many jobs as he possibly could. He would move from place to place. He would actually move back to Vermont for a very brief time to end up teach, for the most part, a school. He would drift from time to time while still trying to study as many law books as he possibly could, while also being a bit of a low-key abolitionist at times and really pursuing a lot of those ideals that he really believed in and fully believed in. But then he would come back to New York, 1852, which would actually be really, really good for him. He would actually move to New York City specifically. First he would move to Cohoes, New York specifically. He ended up becoming a principal, I believe, at a school that his sister taught, at least for some time. And back then, principal meant very different thing than what we look at and think of when we think of a principal for the most part. But for getting my presents mixed up. For Chester A. Arthur himself, he had bigger aspirations. So from time to time, and then eventually deciding after working and saving enough money and really getting an opportunity, he would actually go and move to New York City and read law, at a family friend's house, and an abolitionist lawyer named Erastus Culver. If that name even remotely sounds familiar, Erastus Culver was one of the leading abolitionist lawyers in New York. He was one of the guys that was a big opponent of the Fugitive Slave Act, et cetera, and ultimately was the one guy who was basically just fighting the treachery that the Fugitive Slave Act ultimately ended up causing. And he while there, he would also study at the National Law School in Ballston Spa, New York. And it would take some time. And after a lot of effort, a lot of belief that he can actually do it, Chester A. Arthur finally is able to pass the bar in 1854. And he actually ends up joining Erastus Culver's law firm.